Micro, small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, are the engine of growth in Malaysia, creating jobs for the masses, motivating the development of new products and services, spurring consumption growth, and playing a crucial role in promoting industry competitiveness.
The right knowledge can be acquired only through having the right skills. So I think HRD Corp believes that that we will go aggressive on the year 2022 to make sure that MSMEs and SMEs will be given a lot of attention, and we are working very closely with the employers to make sure that those SMEs employees are trained, will have a proper certification.
Harvard Business Review had actually created an article in 2020, May 2020, and said that it is not about technical skills alone, because technical skills can be developed and you can quickly learn it, but it's more about soft skills.
One, if you look at SMEs in Europe and Australia, the first thing they say is, has this been done anywhere else? If it's not done somewhere else, they don't want to do it. They want to be the first movers to that.
Our characteristics as Malaysians, we are always very forgiving, we are always very shy and all that. So if we really want to do well in many things that we want, really need to learn how to speak up, be the leader.
It has to work both ways. It cannot just be one way where because it's the trend, we want to put more women on the board of directors, let's do it. But we do it with a reason and a purpose. We must find that reason and purpose to achieve that target.
I would like to say thank you so much, and this conference or this engagement from MIM is very timely, and I encourage MIM to do more of this, and if any way HRD can be of assistance and help to you, we are more than happy to support you.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to our second MIM Crucial Conversations for the year. And today the topic is on your right, your role, speak up against corruption, empowering people to build good governance. First and foremost, allow me to thank our sponsor, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and our supporting partners, the Federation of Public Listed Companies, the Malaysian Insurance Institute, United Nations Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei, the Project Management Institute Malaysia chapter, and our media partner, Daily Express, for their continuous support. I would also like to thank our speakers, Dr. Edmund Terence Gomes, Ms. Julie Haggie from New Zealand, and Ms. Tricia Yeoh for coming on board to share your knowledge and experts' insight with our participants. Now, we are close to almost 300 participants who have registered now, and we are not only here on Zoom, but we are also live on MIM's official Facebook page. Well, whistleblowing is one of the most effective ways to detect and prevent corruption and other malpractice. The vital importance of whistleblowers for societies is regularly illustrated by the scandals they uncover and the lasting change they bring. They are now our heroes. Despite the introduction of the Whistleblower Protection Act 2010, which is the act, whistleblowing is still a rare occurrence in Malaysia. According to the minister in the Prime Minister's Department, Dato Sri Dr. Wan Junaidi Tunku Jaafar, during his statement in Parliament sometime in November 2021, a total of 73,545 reports were lodged with the enforcement agencies between 2011 and 2021. However, only 527, which is a mere 0.7% of them, were coming from whistleblowers. This shows that there were shortcomings, whether in the implementation of the Act or in its provisions. In today's webinar, we will deep dive into three subtopics of the theme that has direct or indirect impacts to leaders, both from the government, private sectors, CEOs, SME owners, and professionals. And the three topics are Whistleblower Protection Act 2010, exposing and preventing corruption, and why is this important? And lastly, the fight against corruption, which is critical for Malaysia to accelerate anti-corruption and governance reforms. Now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker for the day, Ms. Tricia Yeoh. Tricia is the Chief Executive Officer of IDEAS, that is the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, an independent public policy think tank group in Malaysia, where she has previously held positions of Chief Operating Officer from 2013 to 2017. And she's also the fellow and a visiting research fellow at ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore, previously known as the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Tricia was formerly a research officer to the Selangor Menteri Besar at the Selangor State Government, and she has previously served as director of Asli Center for Public Studies. Tricia is a regular columnist at The Sun, the Penang Monthly magazine, and she writes on national social economic policies that has delivered various, and she has also delivered various presentations at national and international platforms. She is also the recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal conferred by the Sultan of Selangor and the Monash University Malaysia Distinguished Alumni Award 2017. Her topic today is Whistleblower Protection Act 2010, Reform Efforts and Pending Gaps. Tricia, the virtual stage is yours.
A very good afternoon. Thank you very much to Mr. Siva Gangnam from CEO of the Malaysian Institute of Management. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Also, greetings to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, also a good friend of IDEAS. And to all the participants, I understand that there are 300 people here today, and I'm really thankful that all of you are are sparing the time on a Monday afternoon to be here. So let me tell you just a little bit about Ideas and who we are, and then who I am before we get into the slideshow. So Ideas, for those of you who don't know, we are the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. We have been around for 12 years as an independent public policy think tank. We strive to stimulate critical discourse on issues of public policy that are the most crucial to Malaysia. We work on research and advocacy, so we have publications, books, policy papers, and we also do advocacy to policymakers, political leaders, also through the private sector, connecting the different stakeholders together. And we really believe that having this platform to connect stakeholders together is really crucial in addressing these policy problems that are facing the country today. And there are very, very many of them. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself as well. I feel like I should give you my background. I've been at Ideas since 2013, but I took a three-year break to pursue my PhD. But I myself have been working in various different sectors. I've worked in the private sector myself, contributing to a family-based market research business. I worked in the government and evidently working in think tanks, so the civil society space. So given my own views of being in government, private sector, and civil society, it really helps me to really truly try to understand what are the problems that Malaysia is facing and how we can address that. Okay, today we're talking about whistleblower protection and the Act specifically, right? So before we get into the technical details, and I must preempt you all that the slideshow is rather technical, but I think it's important to understand the technicalities before we understand what do we do to reform it. I just want to highlight like why are we interested in whistleblower protection in the first place? Today's forum is about speaking up against corruption and empowering people to build good governance. In any country that aims to really promote good governance and to promote transparency and accountability, which are really key pillars to any strong and robust institutions that make it possible for businesses to thrive. And all of you are within the business sector, and you know how important governance is to have dependability, to have predictability of policy. You don't want things to overnight be turned because of certain political wishes. And whistleblower is so important because ultimately, if we can provide that space for individuals to speak up whenever they do see any wrongdoing, then we would have provided individuals empowerment. We would empower them to speak up whenever things go wrong. I just want to talk about like the three biggest, I would say, whistleblower cases in Malaysia that would probably all of us know about. So the most recent one is the case of the MACC Chief Commissioner, actually, the case of Azambaki. So as we know, that case still has not been resolved, but the lady who actually blew the whistle on this issue coming about, her name is Lalita, and she wrote a little expose, but unfortunately, she's also being investigated by the police. I think she was grilled for 4 hours. So that's one. I won't go into the details of the case. There's just too much to talk about. We can talk about it in the Q&A later if you want. The second one, of course, is 1MDB. So in this case, it was not so clear who the whistleblower was. There were multiple sources. Politicians like Tony Phua were given information, and of course, a lot of news portals were involved, including Sarawak Report, The Edge, and then also the Wall Street Journal. And then the third would be a kind of distance past ago, would be the case where Rafizi Ramli, also a politician, was the one who blew the whistle on this whole Lembu case, right? Or rather the Cowgate scandal. At that time, the Minister of Women, YB Sharizad at the time. So why is it that so many of the cases you see politicians doing the whistleblowing? It's because many times people are individuals who are afraid to speak up. And so they channel their reports to politicians who they believe would be less unafraid. So that just gives you the context of why it's really important to talk about whistleblower protection in the first place. Okay, so now I'm going to activate my clicker and see if it works. Okay, great. So I will talk to you about the Act because it's important to know what are the problems and what are the rooms for improvement, right? So just backtracking a little bit. This Act, the Whistleblower Protection Act 2020, sorry about that, was enacted to comply with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So its key provisions include a person may make a disclosure. Okay, I won't read every single thing out. You can make a disclosure of improper conduct to an enforcement agency. And the second point is, this is the key thing here. The problem is that while an individual can make disclosure of improper conduct, the problem is that it actually excludes certain things. So it things that are under the Official Secrets Act and the Banking and Financial Institutions Act 1989, the BAFIA, this unfortunately is not allowed for under that disclosure. So if you recall the case of Rafizi Ramli, he was actually charged under the BAFIA Act. And this, actually made him not able to contest in the election. And also the Official Secrets Act in Malaysia is a very archaic piece of legislation. It covers by default all government documents. So the government does have the power to declassify documents under a certain clause of the Official Secrets Act, but by default, all government documents are chalked as official secrets, and everyone who works for the government will have to sign a certain piece of paper that says that you're not going to disclose it. I had to do it when I worked in government as well. Okay, so what are the current problems? So the current problems about the Whistleblower Protection Act, and I'm just going to say WPA for ease of reference, is that if you are an individual who's part of the misconduct, if you happen to be in, for example, a team and you're not the team leader, but you are a member of the team, and you want to blow the whistle on it because you suddenly realize that things are not going the right way, or if you're doing it to avoid this disciplinary action, if you are questioning the merit of government policy, and if it is considered an offense during the disclosure, that's actually possible for the government to revoke the whistleblower status. So this is very restrictive. If you are questioning government policy, that can be practically wielded to include a very, very large array of all government policy, and this is potentially a problem. Yes, okay. So the other problem is that whistleblowing can only be done through an enforcement officer. And as I said earlier, it does not apply to cases involving the OSA and the BAFIA. There's no means for the whistleblower to find out the status of the case. So once you've blown the whistle, this could actually invariably mean that it's going to stay on for a very, very long time. Maybe years could pass before you actually hear anything about it. So I'm talking about the solutions like immediately as well. So number one, basically what we're saying is that we should allow disclosure to non-enforcement agencies. So enforcement agencies, that limits the scope of who you can report to. So if it's just like the police or the MACC, that's very limiting. It should allow individuals to also disclose this information to non-enforcement agencies. Number two, we should also remove the limits on the types of disclosure that is permitted. And thirdly, remove the restrictions on the motive behind the disclosure. Actually, what I'll do is I'll put the link below later on the policy paper that Ideas has published on how Whistleblower Protection Act should be improved upon. So the next big area is to establish the independence of the Act itself. So what we have proposed, and many other civil society organizations as well, is that essentially the Act and all of its mechanisms need to be independent of the executive government. As you know, our executive arm of the government is very, very strong in Malaysia. And the other arms of government, especially the parliament arm, is not given as much independence and autonomy to be able to inspect, for example, the decisions that are being made by the executive. And this act also is no exception to that. So the act allows for the minister, which is not defined, to oversee the workings of the act. So ultimately, if we want these sorts of mechanisms to work, it really does require real independence from the executive. So the proposal that we have is to actually remove the ministerial oversight, and we would also then say that, so okay, if you see at the bottom, the section 2719 of the Act gives the power to the minister to make any regulations as may be necessary or expedient for the purpose of carrying into effect the provisions of the Act. It's not clear in certain situations as well, like what the Act provides for the minister to do. And so this Act, like many other acts that have got to do with ministerial powers, give rather unwieldy powers to the minister. And if we remove that particular oversight and allow for independence of the Act, this would definitely improve the quality of it. So yeah, what the proposal is to be that the Act should be placed in the hands of an independent authority, such as an ombudsman, which should be established for this specific purpose. So many countries around the world actually have this ombudsman. The ombudsman is a very fancy name, but it differs from the Anti-Corruption Commission in that you can complain to the ombudsman on things that are not necessarily related to corruption per se. So an example that was given to me when I visited the ombudsman in New South Wales in Australia is that if there's a certain administrative error on the part of government, you can actually make a complaint to the ombudsman. And there are certain things which, okay, we also know, for example, that the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act, so the MACC Act, is also weak in certain areas, which we've been trying to push for. So that's a different conversation, but we can talk about that later if you want. The point is that where the MACC Act does not cover, or where corruption is not so clearly defined under the MACC Act, these complaints can actually come under the ombudsman. Okay. So the third big area is essentially the need for a more comprehensive and robust whistleblowing mechanism. So this is the mechanism that's provided for under the WPA 2010 Act. So you can see that from steps A to F, what happens is that the enforcement agency will investigate and prepare a report. It will be forwarded to the public prosecutor, and then it would be the result of the action will be revealed to the enforcement agency from the bottom box to the top, the middle box, and then the enforcement agency may report to the minister and the prime minister's department. So you can see that it very quickly escalates to the prime minister level. And then E, the enforcement agency will continue to update the whistleblower on actions taken. And as any whistleblower suffering detrimental action can complain to an enforcement agency. So it does have some steps and it does have some process, but of course, some of these things can be improved. So what are the things that we would propose? Number one, it would be to create a specialized, not a, but several specialized and dedicated units within that particular body that is going to manage the disclosure. Number two, increasing the frequency with which a whistleblower is updated on the process of the investigation. So again, like I said earlier, it's not ideal that the whistleblower is sort of kept in the dark all the time, and regular updates would be ideal. And also third, offering a greater remuneration to whistleblowers. So basically just to reflect the seriousness of the fight against corruption. Okay. So these are just like two slides which talk about how we also looked at what happens in other countries, in the US and in Australia. I think what I'll do is I will just highlight like the important parts of the table. Like, so there's this slide and the next one. So if you look at, in both cases in the US and Australia, and I know that we have Miss Julie Haggie here from the New Zealand Transparency International, so would also welcome her thoughts and experiences from New Zealand. But in the US and Australia, the body that is tasked to manage the whistleblower mechanism is an independent body. So in the US, it's the US Office of Special Counsel. In Australia, it's the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman. And I think even one step below that, right? So I mentioned earlier that I visited the New South Wales Ombudsman. So it's really interesting that at the state level as well, they have their own setup. That's another thing that I really feel important for Malaysia moving forward, that not everything should be centralized. Room should also be given to the state governments to emerge with its own institutions, because a lot of corruption goes on at the state, a lot of corruption goes on at the local council as well. We know this, and there needs to be greater recognition of that at the subnational level. As far as the Act is concerned, I think maybe the only thing to point out here is that in the US, the Act provides protection to whistleblowers who may receive like demotions and so on. So if the company acts on the employee that blows the whistle, there are protections for that particular whistleblower. Okay, protection for whistleblower. Again, the bolded items. Any agency official, so an agency official shall not retaliate against an employee for whistleblowing. And in the Australia case, the Act also provides protection to whistleblowers from reprisal action, and coverage of protection for certain groups. So in Australia, it should be in the other box actually, provides whistleblower protection for persons performing functions in or for an agency. And the other box on the US, again, also provides protections for those who work in federal intelligence agencies. And this slide basically talks about the final two components on anonymity and confidentiality and enforcement. Again, hi, I think I dropped out, sorry. Am I back? Okay, great, thank you. So as far as enforcement is concerned, here in the US, there is an Office of the Special Counsel, and in Australia's case, it is the Ombudsman that has the power to conduct the enforcement. So it's very important that it is an independent institution that's given the right to manage the whole process of the whistleblower mechanism. So I think in sum, the proposal for reforms here, as far as the WPA is concerned, is very clearly, divided into three sections. Number one, protection for whistleblowers. So this is very clear. There has to be a level of protection for whistleblowers that needs to be improved and reinforced. I think here, this would be in the context of anything that you happen to come across in your course of work. All of you come from companies, small and big. Evidently, there would be instances of, well, not evidently, but it is possible that in the course of work, you observe how it is that improper conduct has taken place, whether or not covered by the Anti-Corruption Act. So what's happened in our laws, and in this case, I think since the Whistleblower Protection Act was formed, was legislated for, I just checked the MACC annual report of 2019, and it shows that only 211 whistleblowers actually has been have successfully been granted whistleblower protection, which is very, very few. So if you looked at from 2015 to 2019, and I should have put up the table here, you saw 7 in 2015, 42 in 2016, 44 in 2017, 71 in 2018, and 47 in 2019. So really, 211 individuals who have blown the whistle and have been given protection is a rather minuscule number. This means that not enough people know about the Whistleblower Protection Act, and much fewer even dare to use it because of possibly fear of reprisal, right? So this mechanism needs to be enforced, reinforced, and improved. And then the second is the independence of the Act. The Act still remains vulnerable to ministerial action, as I mentioned earlier, and it really needs to be independent of such influence. And finally, the whistleblowing mechanism needs to be created that is much more robust than the current model. So that's all from me as far as the slides are concerned, but I have actually like 3 remaining minutes. So you can actually stop the slide show. Thank you very much. I think with my 3 remaining minutes, I just want to talk about the environment in which good governance practices are sorely required. And it's not just about the Whistleblower Protection Act. Really, it is the responsibility and the role of government together with the private sector. And the private sector's role cannot be understated here. Because the private sector actually acts as a really, really strong and important pressure point for governments. Ultimately, governments, yes, they can talk about good governance and accountability, but the politicians will not necessarily move unless they feel that that not doing so will result in direct consequence to their immediate abilities to stay in their positions of power. So what I mean by this is, if investments are affected, if the private sector says that it cannot function properly, if it is going to affect business in the country overall, if it is going to affect foreign investor sentiment, and I know that many of these things have been expressed either implicitly or explicitly already, but more of this would be ideal if those sentiments are real as far as improving good governance and exposing corruption is concerned. Because the things that we are trying to say at Ideas and researchers and civil society is that private sector and investments will not be well functioning if our institutions are not stable, if our institutions are eroding at the very core. And it really requires both the government and the private sector, as well as us, civil society, to work together. And I would really welcome these opportunities to talk about how to create that environment that we can all see a flourishing political economy that functions well and secures positive outcomes for us and for the future generation. So it's not just about whistleblower protection. And yes, I've given you a lot of details about that, but it's about whistleblower protection. It's about Witness Protection Act. That's why I didn't talk about that earlier. It's about pulling back the Official Secrets Act, but actually legislating for a Freedom of Information Act, which allows for the availability of government data and information by default and not the other way around. The amendment of the Printing Presses and Publications Act, the amendment of the Sedition Act. Ultimately, what you want is to create an environment in which not just people like us are willing enough, brave enough to speak up against corruption, but in which we can facilitate that, but every individual should feel empowered to do that, including within companies and also the media. So it's about creating this environment, and hopefully the good governance that we strive towards, that we believe is so crucial, such a crucial pillar for our businesses to flourish and for our institutions to thrive, will be something that we can all see in the future. And I look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Tricia. And I must thank you for sharing your thoughts on the proposed reforms on the Whistleblower Protection Act, mainly on the Whistleblower Protection Act itself, the independence of it and the protection for the whistleblower and the need to have a comprehensive mechanism. I can see we have got a lot of questions that has come, and you just hold on, and we will channel these questions to you later. I think I said now we have close to about 400 participants who have logged on. And let's move on to our second speaker for the day. But before that, we will have a short poll of 3 questions. And these 3 questions, we will bring it up now. Can we have the questions now? Yeah. So I would like to ask our participants, could you quickly take this poll? The first question is, over the past year, in your opinion, has the level of corruption in your country decreased, stayed the same, or increased? We also have some international participants today. The second one is, can ordinary people today report the incidents of corruption without fear, or do they risk retaliation or any other negative consequences if they speak out? Meaning, can they report without fear, or there is a fear for retaliation, or you don't know? The last one is, which of the following reforms is or are necessary to the current Whistleblower Protection Act 2010? One is, the level of protection for whistleblowers needs to be improved and reinforced. 2, the Act remains vulnerable to the ministerial action and needs to be more independent. 3, a more robust whistleblowing mechanism needs to be created. For all of the above and none of the above. Just give another minute. We have so far about 190 have participated, 200, about 50%, 52. Right, we got almost close to about 60%, more than 60% participation. Right, I think we'll end here, and then we'll bring up the results towards the end, and let's discuss on these poll results. Now, our second speaker, please allow me to introduce Yeoh, and she's now live from New Zealand. It is almost 7:30 p.m. and I must thank our speaker for coming on board. And she's none other than Miss Julie Haggie, Chief Executive Officer of Transparency International New Zealand. It's a position that she has held since 2018. Incidentally, New Zealand has been ranked number 1 in TI's Corruption Perception Index since, if I'm not mistaken, since 2013. Now, Transparency International New Zealand is New Zealand's chapter of the global anti-corruption movement. For the last 20 years, Julie has led New Zealand's civil society organizations. Julie is highly experienced at advocacy, influence, and in the building of strategic relationship. Julie also focuses on the outcomes, and so is well suited to an organization that promotes transparency, accountability, and integrity. Her topic today is exposing and preventing corruption. Why is this so important? Over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to speak. And Salamat Tangahari, thank you. Yes, as I said, I'm Julie Haggie. I'm going to talk from our position in New Zealand about why it's important to expose and prevent corruption, and also some of the systems we have in place to enable that exposure and prevention. I'm going to talk more broadly than whistleblowing per se, although we'll cover that as well. It was a fascinating presentation from Tricia, and our whistleblowing, our protected disclosure legislation has just been changed, and so it's important to have these conversations globally to see, to compare. I hope my Kiwi accent doesn't make it hard for you to understand me. In New Zealand, we say tēnā koe to an individual and tēnā koutou to a group of people. So tēnā koe to you and tēnā koutou to you all. I was fortunate to visit Malaysia in 2019 for a conference. but I only got to fly in, get a bus to Port Dickson and a bus back. So I know that Malaysian food is fantastic and that there are bats near the water. I'm afraid my knowledge is pretty poor apart from that. But I'll tell you a bit about New Zealand, and if we can just have the slides up. Thank you. And I'll just get my clicker so I can do this thing. Hopefully it's going to work. Clicker's not working so well. No. Thank you very much. All right, next slide, thanks. So New Zealand is quite different. We've got 5.2 million people, so 6 times as many in Malaysia than in New Zealand, and we're about 2/3 the size of Malaysia. So it's sort of similar size, but just with fewer people. 3 languages, that's Maori, English, and sign language. And I know you have several hundred languages. We have 30% of the country in natural reserves, and people have said what a beautiful country it is, and that's because we have mountains down the middle of a very narrow set of islands, and that generates forest on either side. So the people who live on the plains down below the mountains and the cities. We have about 70% European, 16% Maori, and 15% Asian. It includes about 17,000 people born in Malaysia, and many more of Malaysian descent. And some of you would have heard of our Prime Minister, Minister Ardern, who's been very much in the international news. Next slide, thanks. And just to also say, this is how close we are. All we had to do was jump over Australia. We're 9,000 kilometres apart from you today, if you're in Malaysia, and it's not terribly far across that rather large bump in the middle there. I don't know who those people are. We don't like them. If you can move on, please. We do. They're friends. So I want to talk to what I'm going to do today is sort of take a kind of a metaphor. The term above at the top there says he waka eke noa, and that's a whakatoki or a saying in New Zealand. The boats there is what's called a waka armour, a waka, and the armour is that bit sticking out to the side, and it's a very popular sport in New Zealand. I've done it myself, and it's immensely difficult. But he waka eke noa means we are all in this together. When you're in the waka, it's a very heavy boat, and in order to get it moving at speed, you have to be exact in working together as a team. Although each person, as you see below, at the front below, will have a different role at certain points. But the idea is to get it moving as smoothly as possible across the water, even because it has to go through rough water, so that it really picks up and gets you to win the race. And that's kind of the metaphor that I wanted to use today. We're all in this together. So no matter where you are in a private sector or public sector or civil society, and no matter where you are in your organisations, everybody has to work together. Thank you. Next slide. But it is true that in New Zealand, while that might sound very rosy for New Zealand, it's not true all the time. This was the scenes recently at our Parliament as groups of people expressed their displeasure at the government's vaccine mandates and various other things. And you can see below, not everybody thinks that our Prime Minister is fantastic, and there's been a lot of dispute in New Zealand, and our democracy has been under pressure. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about as well, if we move along. Thank you. Next slide. I'll just talk a little bit about Transparency International in New Zealand. We have an anti-corruption focus. We have a volunteer board and with expert members. Our chair is Anne Tolley, who's recently she left Parliament. She was a senior politician and deputy speaker of the House for the last few years. She introduced a code of conduct for parliamentarians. And our patron is the Right Honourable Dame Patsy Reddy, who's just recently retired or just recently come to the end of her term, as the Governor General of New Zealand. So we're very, very fortunate to have people who of high standing who actually have a strong belief in our work. Next slide, thanks. And I'll just flip through that. That's our board, and we are driven by volunteers, and I think that's really important. each of them has a good range of connections and networks and different perspectives as well. So they're quite politically quite diverse, and that helps to bring us together. So we can't just be we're non-partisan. We can't just be one left or right or whatever. We have to be able to be reflective of New Zealand society. Thanks. Next slide. Just to say a little bit about what we do. On the left is our strategic aims, and on the right is what we're actually doing to live those to meet those aims. We do a lot of advocacy on beneficial ownership. We're just about to produce a piece of research on money laundering in the Pacific. We do work on online political campaigning. We do work on open government partnership. We do work on whistleblowing, and we're just about to do a submission or to comment on the act that's come through. And we do a national integrity system assessment. So next slide, thanks. That's just a picture of some of the people who are engaged with us. We have some politicians who support us. We have a Pacific project that's working with Pacific people. We do seminars and webinars and a lot of online meeting over the last 2 years. Next slide, thanks. And our recent reports, including in this the global ones, the Corruption Perceptions Index is the one we do well in, and that's very well. But there are other really important reports that have come out as well. The Pacific Corruption Barometer interviewed 6,000 Pacific people living across 10 Pacific countries, and it was about their experience of corruption and their beliefs, their perceptions of corruption, and that is a really important piece of research that hasn't been done before. So it's really important. The other one that involved New Zealand was the Defence Integrity Index, and interestingly, that showed that there is still a problem with people speaking up in the military. Our new one is coming out shortly. Next slide, thanks. So I'm going to get into the meat of it now. First, I just want to talk about corruption impact and accountability, and I want to say, a lot of people think, corruption doesn't really impact upon the ordinary people. It's just about rich people. But actually, if you have a look at this particular case, this was a case from a New Zealander working abroad, working for Credit Suisse. Now, we've just seen Credit Suisse. There's been an enormous amount of leaks from Credit Suisse, and that's good because there was a lot of cover-ups for a long time. In this particular case, it was a huge fraud engineered by people at Credit Suisse, from employees. That it wasn't Credit Suisse itself, but employees of Credit Suisse who started off a massive tuna bond system, which ended up having huge kickbacks. This New Zealander, Mr. Pierce, down below, pocketed $45 million on his own kickbacks. But the important point I want to make is the impact that corruption had on the ordinary people and the poor people of Mozambique. Their GDP's 1% of that New Zealand, and they live on less than $3 New Zealand a day. And it took 1.9 million people into poverty, below the poverty line in 2019. So it has a genuine and real corruption impact. And I know we can see that. Some people say it's all just about big money, but you see it every day about how it impacts. Next slide, thanks. I also know that there are proven benefits of anti-corruption action, and this research from Malaysia, which I thought was very interesting, doing some background reading, talked about how it will result in greater flows of foreign investment, higher per capita income, higher literacy rates, and increases in business growth, which leads to strong economic growth of the country. And that is the proven benefits in that research. It details it. Next slide, thanks. So why is anti-corruption important? Well, on the sort of country-wide level, there are 3 areas I'm just going to focus on. One is on citizen trust. If citizens can see action on corruption, then they'll have more trust in institutions, they'll have more trust in business, they'll have more trust generally in government. So that's one really important area. The second is that if you fight corruption, if you have anti-corruption measures in place and they're effective, you will see better income equality, because people will have everybody will have a better opportunity to do well. There'll be a fairer tax spread. It's better for business and better for trade. And we know that because we're a trading nation. We know how important our good name is for us. And also it supports political stability. You see more resilience and greater accountability for your politicians. Next slide, thanks. I'm just going to dig down a little bit into that. With citizen trust, and I'll just talk about COVID and what we saw around citizen trust. So what we saw was, for example, transparency around the COVID results. So the numbers of people who were suffering from COVID, the numbers who were being vaccinated, the numbers who were dying from COVID, has all been reported and is still available online. It's still being reported daily and updated daily, and the amount of money being spent on COVID is detailed, and that graph in the middle shows that the amount that was spent in the first big spend of about $64 million, and that shows, and most of that, you can see the big dark blue line is what went to people directly through benefits, through employee benefits. And there were others that went to support businesses as well. But a lot of people were assuming that such a large amount of money would go out quickly and not have accountability, but in actual fact it has. And the Auditor General has also done a lot of checking and reports. That sort of covers those two areas. The third one was around political stability. So because legislation had to be passed at speed and Parliament wasn't able to sit in a room and debate that, which is a really important part of actually gaining citizen trust, we had what was called an epidemic response committee, and that was chaired by the leader of the opposition, and scrutinised the legislation, scrutinised decisions that were being made at pace, and that helped build our political stability. Next slide, thanks. I'm going to move a bit faster through these because I've started. The anti-corruption practice, and I was saying what's some good anti-corruption practices in New Zealand. There are three that I wanted to talk about. One was procurement. We have a particular procurement system, which I think parts of it are world leading, other parts of it need to be better. We also have an Official Information Act, and I think that's a really important element of people being able to hold power to account. And we also have another anti-corruption practices around political party funding. So we have fair amount of transparency around that, although it definitely needs improving as well. Just moving on to the next slide, thanks. So on procurement, this is government procurement, where government procures with the private sector usually, and there are strict rules around government procurement, and the results are published online, so you can go in and look. That is actually a picture I took from the current procurement portal, so anybody can go and have a look. You do have to give your name and say you're interested in it, and then you can watch and look at all the papers that come from it. You can see who's been awarded it at the end. You can see what the process is, and you can work out how to take part in the process. And so it is what you call transparent. They also publish the data from the procurement, from all the government procurement 4 times a year and 3 times a year, and Transparency International has a look at that. What we found from that is that not all agencies are actually filling in the right forms and getting the right data that they need to, but there is another review going on. The results are published, and it happens across local government as well, so it is pretty good. Next slide, thanks. The Official Information Act is another really important part of New Zealand's general transparency. Again, it needs a lot of work. We are very keen to have it improved, but we're fortunate that we've had it. It's been there since 1982. What it does, and what we're moving to with that, because we've had it for so long. So firstly, everybody had to comply, and all the agencies took a while, and they're all slow, and then there's been complaints about it and reports done, and the Auditor General, the Ombudsman complains and says it's not good enough. The Public Service Commission says, no, you'll have to lift your game. And so there is now quite a movement towards proactive release. It's not within the Act, but that will be happening when we get the new Act. It will be happening before we get the new Act. So what by proactive release, I mean that agencies actually put information up that they expect people would ask about before it's asked about. Similarly, all cabinet decisions, all cabinet papers, unless there's got some special reasons for not putting them up, are put up on the public services sites, so you can find out what the decisions were made and what were the papers and information that went behind that decision. And you can also ask local government for information about yourself, and it's really a good way of it's a good mechanism for ensuring that people feel that they can participate, and that they can have confidence in what's happening at government, and they can find out where there's problems. It does require good public sector leadership. Next slide, thanks. The other one is political party funding. We have a lot of rules and oversight of political party funding, and we have limits on donations, on no overseas donations above $50, and it certainly needs a review, and it is being reviewed this year, and it certainly needs tightening up and more transparency. But there is a lot of reporting on. They do have to report to the Electoral Commission on the donations that they've received, and then these are the cases, some of the examples of the cases, the New Zealand First Foundation, National Party donations and Labour Party donations, where 3 parties are actually being prosecuted for not following the rules. And whilst that's a worry, it does show that the system is working. So that's a sort of good, it's good to see something being followed up, and that's what I mean by trust. Okay, next slide, thanks. So just to sort of come to the ending of it, I want to talk about how, when I go back to the He Waka Eke Noa, and talk about the responsibilities of all stakeholders in tackling corruption. So we're all in this together. If you just go back again, thanks, to that previous slide with just go back one, thanks. Back another one, thanks. Responsibilities there. Good. Leaders in government, the leaders have certain roles. The managers and policymakers have certain roles. The operational people have roles, and the civil society have roles. Starting with the leaders, it's their job, and this is whether they're in private sector, whether they're in small businesses, whether they're in corporates or public sector organisations, or if they're politicians. They have the role to set the tone, to take political will, and to lead cultural change. They need to drive legislation. They need to meet their international commitments if they're politicians or public sector executives. They should be developing ethical frameworks. Our Auditor General has just developed an ethical framework for an integrity framework for the public sector. They need to lead by example. They need to publicly support anti-corruption law, lead on industry change, include supply chain integrity, encourage speak-up practices and have those built into their businesses. They need to protect and reward whistleblowers. They should consult, engage, facilitate participation of all sorts of groups. They should take counsel, use evidence base, require risk assessment, learn from their mistakes, show transparency and steward the systems. That's the kind of their role in the waka. It is to call the shots. It is to be the coach, and it is to provide the good equipment and so on that people can actually have their work. For the managers and policymakers, they need to use and develop evidence base and build on what's been done before. They need to apply monitoring and evaluation, internal audit and tech. They need to build anti-corruption into their human resource and reporting programs and learn from them. They should provide sound advice, apply risk assessment, fraud and anti-corruption training, consult, engage, build communities of practice, and be transparent. They're the powerhouse in the middle of the waka, I'd call them, and they also are the ones at the top. If they have to turn, they're the ones that have to put out the paddle and really push hard. So I think they're really important as well. Next slide. Then there's operational staff. And I know there's less written here, but that doesn't mean they're any less important. The operational staff support the ethical culture. They need to understand that and understand how to apply it. They understand the benefits that integrity brings for the business or for the organisation of them and them for themselves. They need to follow anti-corruption policies and standard operating procedures, use reporting lines, engage in training. Civil society is the other group I didn't want to leave out, because that includes media as well. But our job is to hold power to account and to participate in policy and legislation, to promote ethical standards within communities, to promote transparency, to be community leaders, and to educate. Just go to the last slide now. We're coming to the last ones. Oh yeah, that is the last slide. So thanks very much. Perhaps in the questioning, I can talk a little bit more about what's being done. There's a really important report being produced in Australia, and it's called Whistle While You Work. And that is a very good document that offers a 5-step guide to businesses and public sector on putting in place good whistleblowing practices. So it's not just about having a law. In New Zealand, also our protected disclosure regime, the law is not used much, but it's also about building entire cultures within organisations. And there are good guides and good evidence to be able to support you to do that. So thank you very much. It's been great, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for sharing some of these best practices. You will bring up the questions in a short while after we are done with our third speaker, and then we will take it on. Now, our third speaker for today, I'm sure many of you would have heard about him. He has been very much in the news early this year, and he's none other than Dr. Edmund Teres Gomes, former professor of political economy and the dean of Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya. Dr. Gomes specializes in government market relations and the linkage between politics, policies, and business development. He also held appointments at the University of Leeds, UK, Murdoch University, Australia, and served as a visiting professor at Kobe University, Japan, the University of Michigan, and University of California. Between 2005 and 2008, he served as a research coordinator at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Switzerland. Other academic appointments include visiting fellowship at the Australian National University, Canberra, and the Nordic Institute of ASEAN Studies, Denmark. Dr. Gomes' topic for today is the fight against corruption, critical for Malaysia to accelerate anti-corruption and governance reform. Dr. Gomes.
Thank you. Thank you, Siva.
Yeah.
Can I have the slides, please? First, let me thank MIM for inviting me to speak at this forum. When I was invited to speak here, I'm trying to get to the next slide. Bear with me because this is slide slag. Now, when I was invited to speak at this forum, this is what MIM asked me to deal with. These were the three issues. They wanted a discussion on TI's 2021 Perception Index, as well as a discussion on the evolution and failures and successes. I'm surprised the word successes was used there on Malaysia's anti-corruption efforts, and also about how to speak up. So a rather broad range of issues to discuss. And I decided to tackle these issues by focusing on these three issues at the bottom. So at the bottom, what you can see is I'm going to try and explain to you all just two types of corruption, two core types of corruption that exist in the country. Now, these two core concepts, I think, will help encapsulate the complexity of the problems that we're dealing with in this country. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the implications of these corruptions, types of corruption on the political system as well as on the economy. And what I will also try to do here is give you some historical perspective to show you its evolution. And finally, I'm going to end with some suggestions on how to deal with this. But let me start with the broad issue. Let's talk about this very broadly, because Malaysia is a very interesting country. Malaysia is listed as one of the most highly industrialized states in Southeast Asia. The level of industrialization in this country was so rapid, it was listed by the World Bank as a miracle economy, with a few other economies, of course, in East Asia. But the very fact that we were called a miracle economy draws attention to the issue that we have industrialized at a great pace. But what is also interesting, and this is where the paradox comes in, is, and we know our history, this is also a country where we have seen numerous corruption scandals. And it's not just that we have had scandals, the scale and scope of the scandals are just stupendous. So this has raised an interesting question.
Dr. Gomes, can I just interrupt you? Could you speak a bit louder? Some of our participants are unable to hear you clearly.
So this has raised an important question that we have to discuss. How do we explain how the government has been able to generate economic growth while at the same time implicating itself also in serious corruption. How do you find this? How do you find an explanation for this? The second issue is, and this is again a very important point, when we look at the scale of corruption in this country and we compare it with other countries around the world where we've seen stupendous corruption too, the case of Myanmar or Burma, Philippines during the Marcos period, and also in Africa and Latin America, the volume of corruption in those countries were far, far greater than, about the same as what we have experienced in Malaysia. And yet what Malaysia has experienced in terms of economic growth is far, far greater than what we have seen in these countries that I've listed here. So to understand this, what I've done is I'm brought forth two concepts that we use in the literature. The first is on what we call developmental corruption. Now, developmental corruption basically talks about how a government will create a contract where when the contract is issued to a person, the person receiving the contract now has property rights. They own the contract. And when they own the contract, because the businessman has ownership of this contract, he will then try to ensure that it generates profits. So what will he do? He will employ them very productively. So here we have a corrupt act transpiring where a businessman pays a politician to get a particular contract, and then once he gets it, he then uses it to generate profits, which allows him to grow and create a huge enterprise. And we have had a few cases of this, as I will show you. But what we also see here is a form of political financing. And I'm glad that Julie has brought this up, the issue on political financing and how it's so deeply tied to the question of corruption. It's very close. When the politician gives this contract, he also gets substantial funding. And here's the point. The politician will also say, I want you to make good with this contract. I want to see economic growth. I want to see a burgeoning enterprise. But at the same time, when you register profits, I want you to give me a percentage of the profits. We have seen a case in Malaysia where this allegation was made. A contract was given to a businessman by a chief minister, and according to the government documents, the response was he didn't want money up front. He wanted constant money in the form of profits that are made from this project. So that means there's an incentive there also for the businessman to make money, and there's also an incentive for the politician because he gets economic growth. Now, a new body of literature has used the same term, but uses the word excess money. Excess money means we allocate a contract, but I impose conditions on you when I give it to you. If you do not perform with this contract that I've given you, I will take away the contract and give it to somebody else, because it's in the interest of the politician to ensure that this contract makes money. The second corruption that I want to draw attention to is the issue of degenerative corruption. Now here, this is very different. Note the difference, developmental and degenerative. When you have degenerative corruption, when a resource is given by a politician to a businessman, the businessman does not use that contract productively. In fact, what happens is the money may even be channeled abroad. We can also have a case where a politician channels the money to himself, and this is theft or embezzlement, and we have seen cases of this. But even here, we want to make a distinction between issues such as petty and grand theft. When we have theft, we have petty theft and we have grand theft. In this country, we are very, very well known for having disclosed or catching people who are involved in petty theft. But grand theft was never an issue which the government acted on. This only happened after the government fell in 2018 when Pakatan came to power, and then suddenly a whole slew of major politicians were then arrested and charged in court for grand theft. Now, when they were charged in court for grand corruption, what was also interesting is the volume of corruption that was involved here. Now, the second point here, which is also interesting, is what we have, what is known as speed money. Speed money means bribes. Bribes are given. Now, we are uncertain whether bribes can actually be productive or non-productive, because sometimes when you get a bribe, you do get a contract, and then you do it, you do invest it in a way which is productive. But there are also cases where it can lead to serious repercussions. Siva, can you please do the change of the slide for me, because I'm having a problem with my thing. Thank you. Okay, so now let me get into as Julie said, the meat of it. Let's now really understand what those ideas really mean in the Malaysian context. So today we have 2021. 2021 is very interesting because what we are confronted with today in Malaysia is what I call the worst of two worlds, a governing crisis.
I think Dr. Terence line has just dropped off. Could you just hold on for a while we get the team to bring him back? Still with us. There's a lot of questions everybody has posted. We will try and have all these questions raised to the panelists today. We have enough time. Incidentally, compared to the last session, we have increased our panel sessions until 4:15. Previously, we used to end at about 4 o'clock. Now we have extended to about 4:15. So we should have enough time to take as many questions as possible. And let's see what we have now. Could we have his last slide so that at least the participants can read it? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, while we wait for Dr. Gomes to come back, let's take on some of the questions that we have. And I would like to invite Tricia and Miss Julie. Are you still with us?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Great. Let's, probably we'll start with some of these questions. So let's look at one of the questions that we have received from our participants. I'll read from the screen here. The current National Anti-Corruption Plan expires in 2023. What do the panel think about adding improvements to the whistleblowing mechanisms as a key strategy in the new plan, if any, as the current plan does not have any strategies on this area? Probably to Tricia.
Sure. Thank you so much. I was actually participating in a workshop run by the GIACC, the Governance, Integrity and Anti-Corruption Committee that's under the Prime Minister's Department, precisely on the updates to the National Anti-Corruption Plan, NACP. So, of course, the idea was, okay, it's expiring in 2023. What do we do now? How do we do like a continuation of the NACP from here? And of course, given the current political situation, right? Like it's a different government, it's a different administration that actually drafted the NACP, and we've since had like 2 different changes. What was the roadmap moving forward? I think in short, I think the civil servants themselves don't even really know what to do with the NACP. They brought people like us in to try and give them some feedback. But in the specific question of the Whistleblower Protection Act, I mean, yes, absolutely. Like we would love to put that in. But I think as far as the anti-corruption plan is concerned, there are just so many things to talk about and to include in. And I'm so glad that Julie talked about both procurement and political financing, because those are both areas that actually IDEAS has been doing a lot of work on. It's exactly within the very nuts and bolts of procurement. Earlier, I talked about state government and local government and how important those levels of government are. And that's because they also handle a large amount of public procurement, right? And political financing is also absolutely crucial. We are working very, very hard in trying to push for the legislating of the Political Financing Act, called different things. The previous draft was called the Political Donations and Expenditures Act. And we think that, yeah, these are the areas that need to continue being supported if there is a new NACP, but we just don't know whether that's going to happen. And of course, it's an election year. Let's see how the NACP plans go forward. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Just as what Julia was mentioning just now, we need to have the leadership, we need to have the managers, then we need to have the operational people, and then of course next is the the public, right? And when you look at all of this, where do you think we should be looking at the concentration should be? Shouldn't it be on the leadership, setting the tone right? Let's look at an organization. If you look at an organization, and I'm not talking about political, but let's look at an organization. If you look at a case of this, an organizational, I think this is sometime back in 2015, in Toshiba. They had very good internal controls, but in order for it to function effectively, the internal control also needed awareness and support from all the stakeholders. But however, the tone from the top, was not there, because tone from the top is very imperative in raising anti-fraud awareness among the stakeholders. So if you don't have the good tone from the top, it is most likely, it will not be carried out. But in the case of the Toshiba's fraud in 2015, if you go back and then look into this, Toshiba had they had already had all the internal controls, but it was due to the culture of intolerable mistakes. So the heads of the division sought to different ways to achieve the target by hiding the data with accounting techniques. And of course, there was a strong hierarchy of position in which subordinates must obey their superiors. So it still comes back to the culture and the tone from top. What do you think about this?
Oh, Julie, do you want to answer first, and then I'll take the second step.
Yeah, I mean, we had this similar similar situation with our public sector agencies where yes, they had all the internal controls they were supposed to, but in the end, the fraudster managed to sidle up to some of the leaders who then just believed that person and favoured them over other people who were trying to call out the issue, and then that person maneuvered those people out of the organization to put herself into an even more powerful position. So it went on, and I think that tone from the top is absolutely critical. And I think it's also about having integration across your organization. So where you've got so where is your training that then applies to the anti-corruption to anti-corruption policy? So how have you got an external reporting line? That seems to be, that's a really popular thing to be using. That it does seem to help. And these other and what is the line? What are the lines of reporting? And are you actually rewarding people for speaking up? And I think that's and are you providing means for them to do so? And I think that applies to any organization.
Tricia?
Yeah, if I may jump in, I mean, absolutely right that the political leadership ultimately needs to provide that leadership, that setting of tone all the way downwards. However, I also hesitate to equate politics with the management of a company. I think that fails to understand a lot of the intricacies that go on behind the scenes within such a mega structure as a government. So the government is made up of it's not homogeneous. It's made up of multiple different actors. Multiple different groups are also acting simultaneously to influence decisions and leadership at the top. So I think this is actually precisely what we are seeing now. And without getting too much into the details, someone who is a prime minister, as the prime minister that we have today, despite being the top and the man of the moment, there are still things that I am sure he is constrained by. What these constraints are really multiple. You're talking about party politics, you're talking about coalition politics, the civil service, the bureaucracy, basically the deep state, right? That frames something that we've heard of all the way since 2018 when the Pakatan Harapan administration took over. But my point here really is that, yes, while we expect these things to come to leadership, the political leadership also acts in response and in reaction to what they believe are most critical for their positions. So what we need to do as people, as individuals, as actors, is to firstly see ourselves as active actors and to appreciate fully what kinds of incentives such leaders in government are moved by. So once we understand those incentives, then we know, and this is what I was trying to allude to earlier, right, in my talk, that then we would know what are the right things to say and to maneuver. I mean, not that we are the puppet masters ourselves, but I think it's important to know that especially you, all of those who are in attendance today, are very critical actors because you represent industry, and industry is always something that the government takes into very serious consideration. And I think Dr. Terence is back now.
Okay. Thank you, ladies. Yes, Dr. Gomes, you're back. It's
I
okay.
don't know where
We'll
I
continue.
don't know when I fell off the screen. So, and there is some
Okay.
technical hit.
No, it's okay. No problem. You can continue with the slides.
Can you take me to? I'll let the technical
Yeah,
team
sure.
handle
We're
the
going to do
slides.
that now. Right.
Can you take me to where I was? Okay, here we
Yes.
are. Okay, so let me go
A
through
very
this quickly.
important slide.
Let me take you through this very quickly because here I'm trying to show you exactly how developmental and degenerative corruption works. So on one hand, we have Mahathir, who was known to be seen as a developmental type political leader, while in the case of Najib Razak, the most important characteristic feature that we have of him was this issue of where we became known under his administration as a kleptocratic state. So here I'll take you through these things very quickly so that we can get into the discussion. So Mahathir, for example, began this practice of patronage, giving contracts out to politicians, giving contracts out to business people, which was legitimized under a public policy called the New Economic Policy, and the Bumiputra Commercial and Industrial Community Policy. So the idea here was to create a new group of business people, Bumiputras, who also own conglomerates. So he had a clear vision of what he wanted to do. When it came to how he developed it, this is interesting, because we had cases of many people who emerged, like Halim Saad, Tajun Ramli, whose contracts were dissipated and they had to be bailed out. But on the other hand, we had companies like Maxis, Astro, and the independent power producers. When the license was given to them for Maxis, for example, look at Maxis today. Maxis is a major telecommunications company with ventures abroad. If you look at power generation, you will see the power generation firms like YTL, which also received the IPP contract, has now become a major player internationally. So you do see a productive dimension. That was not the case with under Najib Razak. His most well-known business ally was Joe Low, and all his activities were speculative, a waste of funds, making silly movies, buying property abroad, and buying art, and so on and so forth. Mahathir also had a mechanism as to how to develop these firms. He used the stock market. And we could see it. We could see these companies emerging. People invested in these companies. Many people even made money out of this, although a lot also did lose money. But in the case of Najib, we have a case of nobody knew about these companies. They were shell companies. No one had heard of 1MDB, for example, until the whole crisis was exposed in 2015. And then we have the case of Mahathir using domestic firms to raise funds for politics. While in the case of Najib, we see a new phenomenon, foreign firms are now coming into the picture. We are told that donations come from abroad and enter the political system. And this is worrying. Which are these foreign firms which are now funding our political system? Do we want foreign firms to control our political system by funding it? And then we have the money. In Mahathir's case, we do know that money went into Umno's accounts. Mahathir admits that when he handed over power to Abdullah, he gave Abdullah 1.6 billion ringgit worth of money and assets which belonged to the party. He handed this to Umno's money. In the case of Najib, it was a different phenomenon, money going into his own personal account. And here we see also Mahathir creating a wide group of well-connected businessmen. We know in Malaysia today we have numerous well-connected business people. In the case of Najib, when we talk about his time, it was not well-connected people that was mostly in the forefront. It was GLICs and GLCs. We had companies like Tabung Hagie. We had companies like Mara, for example. And these companies were also, these GLCs were also involved in huge scandals. In the case of Mahathir, when we had scandals, it would involve private firms, UEM plus. In the case of Najib, as I mentioned, it was 1MDB. It was Tabung Hagie. And what is also interesting, and here is why the problem is serious, under the GLC system, if you look at the federal and state governments, all 13 state governments in our federation have a GLC system. That means all states have a GLC system which can be abused to serve the interests of the party in power. And here's the very important point. In 2018, when we had the general election of the 13 states, 8 different parties had control of these 13 states. 8 different parties in this country had control of GLCs, which is a mechanism to secure funds. It's a mechanism for the appointment of directors and to award projects. What that means was there was no political will among major political parties to bring about a change to the system. Most political parties, the major ones at least, were benefiting from the system. And then in terms of politicians in business, as you know, by the time Mahathir ended his term, we were talking about crony capitalism, rent-seeking, corruption. When Najib and even Abdullah came to power, Najib also said it. When he came to power, we must eradicate cronyism, rent-seeking, and corruption. It had already become embedded in the Malaysian system. But we did not see that happening under Najib. In fact, what we saw here was, in fact, the enormous use of money now in federal elections. In 2013 election, a lot of money was used in that election, and there was concerns, where was all this money coming from in the 2013 election? Mahathir used the word cash is king, again later in 2018. Where was all this money coming from in 2013? Later we found out it came from 1MDB. So I'm capturing here the broad scale of the corruption and how it's manifested itself, its implications on the Malaysian economy. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now we come to where we are today. As you know, since 2018, we've had a change of government 3 or 4 times now. We have 3 governments since 2018. The government and the state is always in flux, constantly changing. There's talk now of a new general election, another general election which will be held very soon. Now, when you have a government which is constantly changing, it raises the question of where does the power lie? Who has this power? Who exactly controls the state now? During Mahathir's time and Najib's time, we knew we had a single dominant party, we had very powerful prime ministers, we knew where the power was situated. So here today we have a problem. Is the power really in the hands of the current prime minister as it was under Najib Razak and Mahathir? No, of course not. There's a need to deconstruct the state, to understand the flow of power. Once we understand that, we'll also understand how it's deployed. That's difficult to do, but that is something we have to. We want to understand also what is happening in the country today. The second point, this is very important, is the distribution of power. There's no asymmetry in the distribution of power. We have institutional capture. And we have seen this most recently in terms of these exposés on corruption, the inability of even the executive arm of government, the once powerful prime minister, to act against institutions on one hand. And then in other cases, we do see the prime minister having the ability to stop certain investigations from going through. So the situation has become far more complex in terms of, at one point we had institutional capture devoid of autonomy, but now it may not necessarily be so. it depends on the institution that we are talking about. We have to discuss that too. The third issue is on policy repercussions. What do we know? We know the implications of what has happened is that we have had wealth and income disparities. This is a serious problem in this country, the wealth and income disparities. We know now there's a rise of a new rich through racial preferences, giving contracts in a selective way. This is another big problem. The abuse of policies meant to solve problems between ethnic groups have been captured by the state to enrich an elite. Environmental degradation, massive projects leading to serious degradation of the economy, leading to massive floods. We have seen that in Kuala Lumpur, we have seen that in Penang, we have seen that in other states in the peninsula. And of course, the issue of workers' rights, clearly curbed. They can't even give a proper minimum income, minimum wage to workers. And what are the outcomes of this here also in terms of the issue of rent capture? Who is capturing the major contracts today? We saw the scandal we saw the controversy involving the 5G network, Digital National, which delayed the implementation of 5G. And there was a lot of controversy around that. Just today, a new controversy is emerging around the My Sejahtera, who controls the My Sejahtera web page. And then we have new issues, structure and agency, economic and regulatory institutions. On one hand, we saw what Muhyiddin did. When he came to power, we saw how Muhyiddin abused the GLCs to give directorships to politicians to hop. So abuse of the GLCs to encourage party hopping, which further created a highly dysfunctional political system. More recently, we had the case of Bank Negara, 1MDB, implicating the former governor of Bank Negara. We have had the previous Inspector General of Police saying that there's a big problem with the police system and there's a need to resolve it. So there are a series of issues here which talk about institutions which are supposed to be responsible for monitoring corruption, but themselves are mired in corruption. Now we have a real problem. If the institutions which are supposed to monitor corruption are themselves mired in corruption, where does this leave this country? Can we have the next page, please? So let me take you through the problems today. I said we are probably confronted with the worst crisis we have ever seen in this country. The problems are, we started off with Mahathir introducing the patronage system, leading to corruption, which then led to the serious problem of kleptocracy. If we look at it today, we have a problem of both corruption and patronage acting simultaneously. And I've also mentioned a few cases after Muhyiddin's term in office. I've also mentioned the point that the reason why we can't deal with this is there's no political will. Political leaders are hesitant, reticent to act on this because it may also it means relinquishing power over important economic institutions which are a major source of financing for politics or to use to capture support among the electorate. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Agency, the MACC, itself is under question, under serious question, and now hardly inspires confidence. And when that scandal involving MACC broke, we saw how important institutions like the Securities Commission was also compromised. And I already mentioned Bank Negara and the police. And what we also see now, and we have to be very careful about this, is that we see when we see very vibrant electoral system where there's contestations between many parties, what we're also seeing here is the rise of business tycoons entering politics, what we call checkbook politics. Now we've got to watch for this state capture by businessmen who decide to enter the political process because that's a means to then capture control of public policies. And how do they do it? They pay for it. They further monetize the system. Even in the last Johor state election, there was some controversy about a lady the daughter of a well-known business tycoon who had entered the political system, and there was a debate about her entry into politics. So you can see this is not a trend that started with her. It's started we saw it also in the previous election. Now here's the point I want to stress. If we have a system like this, how do companies react? The companies know how to adapt to the system. They will change accordingly because they have to survive. They will make it a point to understand the system, and then they will adapt to the system. And this leads to the perpetuation of the system, which is why we've seen the system in place. And that makes it also difficult to dismantle the system. Even among the business community, there are problems getting them to buy into to to dismantle the system. And when we do try to get them, they are also hesitant to speak because they have supported the system. They have also given out bribes and other means to get contracts from the state. So this brings me now to the next point on policy and business methods, which we must know about. Recognize the importance of the GLC system. We saw it under Mohideen, how he used it to secure power, consolidate his power base. The importance of the GLC system is also crucial because in the post-pandemic period, there's no doubt about it, state-owned enterprises are a key player in the world economy, and not just in Malaysia, in the world economy. If they're such crucial players in the economy, and if they're also abused, what does this mean for the Malaysian economy? And then we see the rise of foreign firms, China's state-owned enterprises also entering. And now we see links between China's state-owned enterprises and Malaysia's GLCs. One example of a major scandal involving this was ECRL, state, two governments with using their GLCs and their state-owned enterprises to form a joint venture to implement a major project, which was then mired in one of the most serious corruption, one of the most serious scandals that we have seen in this country. And then we have policies. And look at our policies, the shared prosperity vision. There was nothing new in the shared prosperity vision. And this was by a government which promised us in their manifesto, no more race-based policies, and then promptly reintroducing it when they came back into power. And these kinds of use of race-based policies to give out contracts, as I've showed you, is degenerative. It does not bring much value to economic growth. There's a serious wastage of resources here. And in terms of excess money or developmental corruption, yes, we still have that. And we should not support it. There are many people who said, we industrialized, we became a nation miracle. So what's wrong with developmental corruption? What's wrong with developmental corruption was what we saw in 1997. Just as we became a very highly industrialized economy, we also quickly fell in 1997, and it was attributed to this issue of developmental corruption. So even this issue of trying to be productive in our corruption, please don't buy that argument. Which brings me to my final points of the key reforms. We really have a lot on our plate to think about. Now, I prefer a more comprehensive approach. Others may disagree. I'm sure Tricia will have a different viewpoint on this. Some prefer a piecemeal or an incremental approach. We've got to talk about it. I'm not saying we can put everything on the table and get everything done. In fact, I do agree an incremental approach may also be something which we seriously should consider. The Political Financing Act, and here I'm glad that Julie brought it up. Julie mentioned a couple of times about the importance of the political financing system and how it's important to keep an eye on it. We don't have a Political Financing Act. We've been asking for this since 2008. Here again, no political will on the part of politicians to introduce this. This is a real stumbling block that we have, that our politicians are not willing to support these kinds of reforms. And the point was made both by Tricia and by Julie, the need for a Freedom of Information Act. Apart from the Whistleblowers Act, which is weak, we also need a good Freedom of Information Act. How else can we know what's going on in this country unless we have a proper Freedom of Information Act where we can get access to data? And as for the anti-corruption agencies, MACC in particular, we really have to get that agency reformed quickly if it is to inspire confidence for us to move to solve corruption. Now, I want to close on this point. Let's be careful about the problem of the revolving door. Who is entering the political system? Who are those who are running for elections? Where do they come from? Whose interests do they represent? If they represent the interests of big business, then we may have a problem of state capture too. And if they do enter this political system, are they bringing with them also much money, which is going to further monetize the political system? And what are the implications of all this for corruption in this country, which is already in a bad state? And I want to close on this because the general election is impending, and these are issues we need to look at. And these are issues we need to put to our politicians too. These are reforms we need to take to them. The general election serves as a good point where we can demand for these reforms. And politicians tend to be most responsive during an election time. Thank you, Siva. I'll hand it back to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Gomes. Like what you have said, looks like we have got quite a bit on our plate. And let's see what our participants say. And as at now, we have close to about 390 participants who are still with us. And I want to thank all of them for staying with us. And let's bring the poll questions and the answers. Let's see what our participants will have to say. So there are about 251 out of the 402 participants who took the poll, about 62%. So let's see what's on the first question, the poll first. Okay, over the past year, in our opinion, has the level of corruption in your country decreased, stayed the same, and increased? About almost 70% of them say it has increased. Now, on this question itself, I want to ask the panelist, what do you think? Is it because, during the COVID time, we had a lot of funds to be dispersed? Is that fresh in your mind? And with the recent cases of flood and all the others, is that something that's really still fresh in the minds, and that gives an impression that it has increased? Or is it genuinely increased, or it has been status quo, or increased to a small order?
Let me answer that.
Okay.
Let's talk about how we define corruption. If we define corruption as abuse of power, then yes, it's very clear. There's been serious abuse of power. At the time when Pakatan fell, we saw that issue of how the new government abused its power, primarily, for example, through the abuse of the GLCs, the awarding of directorships to politicians so that they will hawk. And this was at a time when we needed to use those companies very effectively. And since then, we've had other issues which have been brought to the fore. 1MDB has been discussed a lot in the press, but let me also remind you, we've had the court cluster. We had court cases where the allegations against Najib, his wife, Rosma, Adnan, Musa, we've had so many cases where it has brought to the fore the level of corruption in this country. So things haven't improved since then, which is why I can totally appreciate this point about why people agree or think the corruption has increased in this country.
Tricia?
Yes, I also agree. I think I can see why this is the perception. There were, over the last year alone, many party hopping cases in Sabah, and we know that many of the individual politicians have switched parties, and this is not news. People have actually explicitly talked about enticements that were given to politicians to switch parties. There was a very high-profile case of Azambaki, which has not yet been resolved, and the fact that he was called to appear before the Parliamentary Select Committee that's in charge of agencies under the Prime Minister's department, but he failed to turn up, and the fact that there's been a big, discussion over the finer points of the details of the standing orders of Parliament to determine whether or not he can or can he be compelled or not to appear before the Parliament. I mean, it just means what it sends the signal off to the public is that the Chief Commissioner of MACC, who is supposed to be the bastion of all things anti-corruption in the country, there is some reason to prevent him from appearing before such a committee. So I think it is these big, high-profile incidents that lend to this perception that corruption has increased. I'm not so sure about. I think yes, the flood and the repercussions on general what people feel in their pockets. I think that may have an impact as well. Even throughout the pandemic and definitely during the floods as well, the response from the authorities and the institutions, especially the welfare institutions, were not as forthcoming as they ought to have been. So you can see the institutional breakdown, and you can see the erosion of institutions. And I think people are just equating all these things that have happened with a breakdown, and therefore, again, how do we define corruption? But if corruption is the way that public monies have been used for abuse and have resulted in leakages that have not resulted in these, better outcome for society. Really, I think that the incidents of the last 2 years actually would lend the perception to this. 70% is really high. I must
Really
say.
high. Yes. And Julie, you just mentioned that we are not so far away, right? It's only about close to about 8,900 over kilometers. So what is your perception? Don't worry, it's okay. Go ahead.
I can't talk about Malaysia, but for New Zealand, the stresses have been legislation being passed at speed, large amounts of money, huge amounts of money passing through the systems without the level of monitoring you would normally expect. I guess it's about the accountability mechanisms that we've had in place for that and the reporting on those to the public that is holding the level of public confidence. And I think having integrity systems built throughout it that will hold well under severe pressure is the mark. It's your integrity. How strong are your integrity systems? That's really what it's about. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. And let's look at the second poll question. Can ordinary people today report incidents of corruption without fear, or do they risk retaliation or other negative consequences if they speak out? So it is also here quite clear, right? About 85%, there's a fear of retaliation. I think this is what Tricia, you also had mentioned, right? The need for protecting the whistleblowers. Let's move on to the third question. Yeah, go ahead. You wanted to share something.
I mean, I just want to say that this is actually very worrying. I mean, yes, I talked about it in my session, but to see the numbers so high, it's a very worrying sign, right? Because it means that we are just generally afraid. I mean, we've been conditioned into thinking that we can't report, we can't speak up. And if people in the private sector feel that we can't, how much more so people in the public sector? So this is something worrying. Maybe this is something that ideas will need to work on. Like we need to maybe target and do a campaign for private sector individuals and companies as well. But just on this note, I just want to say that in all my years of working in public policy, I think that there are always ways to say things that will not actually land you in hot soup. Like I've never been arrested, and we are pretty vocal about stating things critically about certain policies. But I understand when it's got directly to do with incidents of corruption, especially if it's got to do with a particular individual. I understand the fear there, but really, it's only if from what I can observe, if you have a very large following, say you are a young politician who's trying to start a young political party, I think the government also is quite clever in the persons that they target and who they believe they would slap like a very strict, strict consequences. What I'm trying to say is that we should try to encourage this, but I understand that the conditions surrounding us now are
Right.
not. Yeah.
Yes, I think Dr. Gomes definitely has got something to say on this.
Terence say something as well.
I must add that I am not surprised with this figure. I'm working on a project with Tricia's team and ideas, and we were interviewing a lot of business people. And when we interviewed them, what they told us was, whatever we tell you is you cannot disclose it, anonymous. They knew so much. They knew how the system worked. They could tell us things that we didn't know, but they would not speak publicly about it. And what more, the people on the ground. The case of Lalita and the MACC, when she exposed the corruption in MACC, look at she was hailed as a heroine in this case for whistleblowing or for exposing this. But look at her today. The case is MACC has been exonerated, or Azambaki we've been told They have not been further with this investigation by the government, while she is being sued by Azam as well as other business people. Where is the protection for people who expose corruption? And I feel they have a right to have this figure of 85%, because if that can happen to someone like Lalita, who used to work for an anti-corruption NGO and spoke openly about her work and what she could expose, if that can happen to her, what more the people on the street? So the Whistleblower Act, I agree with Tricia here, really needs to be beefed up. The way it's done now, it hardly protects the whistleblower. There's no real incentive for people to come forward.
Julie, from an implementation perspective, what is it that you are doing well in this area?
Just on that last point too, I think that our new act includes a clause protecting the whistleblower even if they are wrong. So if they have made an error, not deliberately, but if they were wrong, but they spoke up, the law protects them. So I think that's a really important, it's a really important element to include in any whistleblower legislation. And I'm strongly encourage people to look at that and also to include it in their business policy, because it's not just about protected disclosure is one thing. Having that type of system within any business is another thing, really. Even if you are wrong, even if you haven't got your facts quite right, we still appreciate you speaking up, right? Now I know there's elements of people's personnel, people's the reputation of people as well. But if it's done within a protected way or within a confidential way within the organisation as well, then they should be allowed to speak up, even if it's found out afterwards that they didn't understand the full situation or there was some other issue. So I think that's a really important. I just like that point.
The intent and the purpose has to be right. Yes,
can I push Julie on one more point, Julie, that you can probably help us with? What New Zealand has is a level of institutional autonomy, independence, which can also check the executive arm of government, which helps. That is something we are lacking here. Is that true, Julie?
Yes, and even more so with our Public Service Act. So our new Public Service Act places the responsibility of the public service, their main responsibility is to the people, right, not to the government. So their main service is to the people of New Zealand. And that is then things like they have to produce long-term long-term insight reports, which can look across government, years of government. So they have to say, looking out 10 years, this is what's going to be the reality here, we think. So those sort of things are for the people of New Zealand, not for just that incoming parliament. They're not just there to service that the executive.
Yeah. You need a very strong political will and an inspiring leader. Let's move on to the last question. Right. Tricia, looks like it's all spot on for you. Okay. Which of the following reforms are necessary to the current Whistleblower Protection Act? The level of protection for the whistleblowers. The Act remains vulnerable to the ministerial action and needs to be more independent, right? A more robust whistleblowing mechanism. So, but almost 70% say all of the above, right? So let me move on to the questions. Now, if you look at the Auditor General's report on non-compliance with financial management that has resulted in issues of irregular payments amounting to about 1.3 billion, loss of public funds of another 11.45 million, and a waste of 8.87 million to the government in 2020. So in the panel's view, how should this issue be addressed, as this seems to be a annually recurring issue, and in the case of New Zealand, Julie, does this happen, and how do the authorities handle this?
So let me understand, is this about how the money is used that was budgeted for? Is that right? The budget transparency,
Yes.
right? It's an accounting for the money that was used. And the wastage is where? Is the wastage talked about where the wastage has gone? Is it open transparency around that?
Yeah, it talks about the wastages. Definitely there are the details inside there.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you've got systems of having to account for each agency has to account publicly, and if that should all be very clear for ordinary people to see. Should have open transparency on your budgets, and they'd be set out so that they're really clear to understand, and then people can hold them to account. Largely, it's the media and the opposition holding the government to account, and I think that's the level of wastage will be a measure of will be one of the measures that go to the ballot, I think, in votes. Yeah. New Zealand.
And Dr. Gomes, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would like to build on a point actually that Julie hinted at. Let's make a distinction between corruption and wastage. There's a huge difference between corruption and wastage. Corruption usually is harder to determine. It's done so covertly, and it normally comes out when there's a whistleblower, or if one person decides between the giver and the taker, one decides to expose it, decides to blab. But wastage is easier to identify. The government has a budget. The budget is given to a particular institution, and they're supposed to what we call deliver the public delivery system. They're supposed to deliver that project on the ground. And here you see those projects don't get delivered. In fact, if they do get delivered, also they get delivered in a manner which is highly inefficient and does not produce the outcomes that were expected. And that's a wastage. So here I would like to look at this very carefully, because what we do see is a lot of wastage happening. I can give another wastage, which I know, which is phenomenal, which we have seen, is the appointment of directors of government-linked companies. They all get a stipend. That's a serious wastage, because what productive contribution are they making to the economy? They shouldn't even be sitting there. And do we even need these companies on the ground? So that's a wastage. But that's not corruption, That's a legitimate issue where they are allowed to get this stipend. It's a legitimate issue to channel these, according to the budget, this must go to the ground, but it's wasted there. So that's where we talk about public sector reform. There is a big debate now, even if you look at the 12 Malaysia plan, there's a big debate on the public delivery system and how dysfunctional that is too. There's a big debate about how bloated the public sector is also. And those are issues that we need to look into also if we want to deal with this problem of wastage, because if you have an inefficient public sector, you won't get the projects delivered to the ground. Siva, you're mute.
Tricia, this question is directed to you. Are we not allowed to whistleblow pertaining to government or financial institutions wrongdoing?
You are, but like I said, if it has something to do with the Official Secrets Act, or in relation to Bafia, or even one of the sections of the Penal Code, then that's basically not allowed for. I mean, rather, you will just not be considered as given whistleblower protection. And as I mentioned in one of the slides as well, government policy is also not included, which to me, that's very ridiculous, because evidently there are many things to do with government policy that one could imagine one would blow the whistle on, whether it's in the actual policy itself or the poor implementation thereof, which therefore brings me to the question of the Ombudsman, right? So sometimes the lack of adherence to government policy doesn't necessarily mean that it is an outright corrupt practice as defined by the MACC Act. And again, there are flaws there. So there are certain sections that we've been talking about wanting to change. So sections 23 and 36 in particular of the MACC Act that have got to do with things like the living beyond one's means. So public servants who live beyond one's means. Right now, if it is even evident that they're living beyond their means under their given salary, there's nothing that you can do because it's not classified as a corrupt act. But the point is that the Ombudsman could be an alternative independent institution that you can therefore report to if there is non-compliance with a certain government policy, which right now would not allow you to do under whistleblower under the WPA. But yes, you can blow the whistle on any of the above, but there are also a list of a very, very long list of exemptions. So this seems to be the norm and the pattern in government law and policy. So there's a law and a policy, and the work that we're doing with Dr. Terence Gomes is on competition. So there's a law, there's a policy, but then there's also a long list of exemptions.
Yeah, there's another follow-up. Go ahead.
Can I just add on to this, because an important point has been raised on, which I'd like to link with the earlier point on wastage, the procurement process. The procurement process falls under the Official Secrets Act. It's under the procurement process that we see a lot of abuse of power and wastage. That is something we need to address immediately. And I like Julie's presentation because she drew attention to the procurement process. They have that in New Zealand, but I'd like to bring Julie in because here I think it's far more open. We can see what is happening in the procurement process, and that will reduce wastage and abuse of power.
Yeah. Actually, while you were, your line was cut off, Terence, I brought in the procurement issues and also political financing and the work that we've been doing on that. And just specifically on procurement, I think like right now there's something that's developing with regards to this Malaysia. So there are two very opposing points of view, and I think I would encourage everyone to read about that. I mean, I'm getting the research team here to read about it as well. The procurement, right? Or rather the sale of Malaysia to another private company, and there are just like so many disputes around that, like what was the process involved, and really public procurement needs to be done properly. And also this pattern that I mentioned earlier of rule and exemption seems to apply because a lot of government is supposed to comply with the Ministry of Finance Procurement Division rule, so the procurement rules, but there are lots of exemptions as well, right? Like, so do the PPPs comply? Do the GLCs comply? Do the special purpose vehicles that are set up, and there's so many numerous special purpose vehicles, do they need to comply with the procurement rules? Like, we don't even really know.
Right, and there is another question from, it's a follow-up question to the same one, is, when cases fall under the purview of the Official Secrets Act, who then determines if it is true, or is it camouflage crooked acts? Should it not be the court who decides on this? Of course, you talk about the Ombudsman. Do the courts have a role in this?
Can I just say, in New Zealand, we don't have that same Official Secrets Act covering many things. In general, our law says it will be released, only in certain exceptions, very specific exceptions will it not be released. So then you go to there is some things under our security measures, military. Some military information that might be, or some information relating to competitiveness, business competition sometimes. But in general, if the rule is always it will be released, it should be always released. That's what any official information act should say. It should be released. Transparency should rule on every occasion, and you should only be an exceptions basis that you don't release. And I think that's the way to go with any. That's the way to go. That's the way to go on that. It just sounds extraordinary that you don't have the right for citizens to say, "Give me the information that I need to run my business about what's held about me, about what this policy has done and who made that decision, about where that money came from, about which organizations are involved." It is just that is just one of the core elements of an integrity, a country that has integrity, and it's also a core to trust, to business trust, if they can see what's going on, that there's a fair process going. Just on the procurement thing, I think the problem is too that we have the same problems that there are exceptions. So what Tricia was saying is really true for New Zealand as well. That yes, you have a procurement rules system, but then the government's got this all of government panel set up, and there's stuff going through there, and then there's sort of a set, and then some of the ministers have had access to a large fund, which is pretty lacking in transparency about some would argue. So I think there's still a problem for some countries like us.
Right. So let's move on to a little bit on the corporate setting. So in a typical corporate setting, to whom can an employee report unethical practices? Whistleblowing. Is it to the CEO? Is it to the internal auditors, the board, senior management? The question is, who is most trustable? As any of them could be biased. This is from one of the participants.
Well, I can answer that because we're actually developing that for ourselves. So Ideas has our own whistleblower protection policy. And I mean, of course, that ideally should be the case, right? So all companies ideally should have their whistleblower protection policy. And what we've done, well, we're a small organization, 25 staff. We have a board. So the board has appointed 2 individuals who will take up any reports and complaints with regards to whistleblower reports. And individuals in the staff can send an anonymous email to these members, and they are basically on a board committee. I mean, that's what we have so far. I'm sure it can be improved. But I think the main thing is that before you even talk about the mechanism, the companies and the leaders of companies need to see that this is important, right? Because as companies and organizations grow, there's just so much more potential for abuse to take place. And yeah, I think it's important. And so many companies just don't have the time or resources to think about setting up such a mechanism or a policy in the first place.
I'll move on. Thank you, Tricia. And the next question is if someone who is aware of if someone is aware of a corrupt practice by a certain party but did not report it, is there any action that can be taken against this person when it was subsequently discovered that he is aware of the corrupt practice?
I think it's very difficult to lay blame on the person because there may be so many reasons for which the person did not report it. I don't think in my understanding now there is any mechanism that could compel the person who knew about it, didn't do anything about it, to be considered as liable for anything. But I guess this goes into the gray matter, right? The gray matter of options and so on. But I'm not sure. Terence, do you know the answer to this?
I think it depends who this person is. If he's a member of the board of directors, he has a fiduciary duty to protect the shareholders. And if he does not play that role, then he's equally liable. So I want to make a distinction between those who sit in management, the board of directors, and the workers at the bottom. For workers at the bottom, if they do not report it, I don't think it's a different set of issues here. But when it comes to board of directors, there's no question about it. If they don't want to play that role, then don't become a member of the board of directors. If you do it, then you agree then to take a strong stand on this and to protect the interest of the shareholders.
Brilliant answer.
I'd just like to add,
Thank you, Dr. Gomes. Yes, Julie.
just on the other point is people who support the person who whistleblows. So in New Zealand, the Protection of Whistleblowers Act that's just gone through, also enables protection for those people who are supporters, who know about it and who assist the person to report. So because sometimes, where there's a strong attempt to try and have a go at them, there's also a backup for those, so that somebody might go for the other people who reported, and that protection also applies to those people. So I think that's as important as having, just on the other side of it, as important as having as having protection, as generally having protection for that whole system.
Right, we got another 5 minutes more, right? And let's look at this question. And one of the participants has said, in his opinion, in his or her opinion, the whistleblower should not be rewarded. He says that it defeats the purpose because one, the aim is not to compensate whistleblowers, but to provide an avenue to highlight integrity issues. Two, rewarding them itself creates doubt. That means paying someone for information, which is a corrupt practice by itself. The panel's opinion.
I totally agree with that. I don't see any reason why a whistleblower should be rewarded. The whole idea about the Whistleblower Act is to serve as a mechanism to check corruption. And as you pointed out in your earlier question, Siva, when you're exposed to a particular corrupt act, you should be duty bound to expose it. And that's why the Whistleblower Act comes into play. There's no question to my mind, on the issue of reward for this. The long-term implications of doing that is that the company will be better run, the economy will grow better. There are a lot of good things that come out of being a whistleblower or to expose corruption, because the implications on you also personally there are many benefits for doing so.
I'll just jump in here. So, I'm looking at the research that we did previously, and this paper was published some time ago, and I put the link for the participants to read. So the examples that we cited were basically in the US. So the Dodd-Frank Act, which was very revolutionary at that time, it authorized the US Securities Commission to pay rewards of 10 to 30% of recovered funds. So this kind of brings to mind like the 1MDB recovered funds as well, right? It's also a point of dispute because the refunds were actually returned to the very government that approved it. So, but the other example that we cited was South Korea. So we looked at South Korea, and their Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission is able to provide whistleblowers with rewards of up to $2 million. And I think in the context of providing rewards, it was actually to encourage those who are fearful of taking the risk to whistleblow. I understand the principle, like you don't reward something that's actually supposed to be good governance based on the principle of good governance anyway. But I suppose in situations where the person feels that the risk is very, very high, then that was the idea behind the remuneration. And our act actually does provide discretion to the enforcement agencies to order rewards as it deems fit. But I think this is I can see both arguments. I think it's okay because it does it is a big risk for some people to take. I don't see a major problem with it, but I can understand the perspective of those who believe that rewards are unnecessary.
Julie, your thoughts?
I think it depends what kind of organization you're in a way, and what kind of reward is being talked about. So the Australian research, Whistling While You Work, looked a little bit into this issue, and they found that some people in organizations where speaking up was promoted by the leaders and a part of the culture, that they flourished in those organizations. They did better in their careers generally by being open. So that was a reward of some sort of the way the organization was structured. But other people, it cost them a huge amount as a person who spoke up. So it cost them a large amount in the way people talked about them. You're the one who told on people, and so I think it's something where I think it's a policy decision and a wee bit where more research is needed to see what is actually the outcomes for people and whether it is something. I understand where people are coming from, but I think there is a little bit more to dig into this issue around reward and what it means and why when it can be applied and when what sort of situations you can have where it's not necessary. Yeah.
I have one last question to the panel. Currently it feels like it is not safe to speak up against corruption. Right? What is the best avenue to do it?
I can say, I'll just talk to that briefly and say
Okay.
that speak up lines, anonymous speak up lines, have proven to be incredibly effective in bringing to attention issues that are burgeoning in organisations for organisations to. And in New Zealand now, speak up lines are used extensively, and where they're anonymous, the research does show that they will bring they will bring out those issues for the organisations to deal with. So I think that that's one really important area that organisations should look at. That'll be my 5 cents.
Okay.
I
To
think,
maintain the anonymity. Go ahead, Tricia.
yeah, I think technology presents us with a lot of possible solutions here. Tech can, take in anonymous reports. Tech can be channeled to the appropriate organization. I think we're just not using enough of that. But ultimately, there just still needs to be that public trust in the system, right? Because tech can still be traced. I mean, there will still be traceability. And again, going back to the MySejahtera example, like tech is also about personalized data. Right now, the current routes that are available to Malaysians who do want to report corruption, the practice is to go to the media. A lot of people do that. Another practice is to go to organizations that defend corruption. Dr. Gomes is here on the board of C4, a very famous anti-corruption NGO in Malaysia. So I know that whistleblowers do go to them as well. And of course, like I said during my talk, to politicians, right? So these are the sort of 3 avenues that are available to Malaysians at the moment. I don't think that this is sustainable. Ideally, we would want this to expand. We would want it to ensure that it goes like far beyond these avenues. And ultimately, it should be safe to report it to the entities within government itself. The fact that there were only, 211, right? Whistleblowers over the last 5 years says something about the lack of faith in the system, whether it is the police or the MACC and so on.
Dr. Gomes.
Well, I must say that unfortunately, it is this fear that's holding us back from instituting the reforms. I remember FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, saying there's nothing to fear but fear itself. We have to find a way to overcome this fear because that's what holds people in power in good stead. That they can put fear in the minds of people, and that allows them to get away with the corruption that they are now perpetuating. When I gave my talk, I said I'd never seen the situation as bad as it is today. So I want to qualify what I said by bringing that point up. Why is it so bad? Even the institutions which we thought had some level of independence have now proven to be captured institutions, compromised institutions. That's why the situation is so bad. How can we talk about going to the MACC when the leader of the MACC himself has been implicated in corruption? How can we talk about going to the police when the IGP of the police said before he left, before he stood down, the police is in bad shape? Where does this leave the people? That's why I'd like to reiterate my point. The first thing we really got to do is the institutional reforms have to be put in place to inspire confidence in these institutions. Because you go to the institutions, you lodge the report with the institutions, and then they take it forward. But those institutions must be autonomous, independent of the executive arm of government. That's the first thing we need to do if we want to deal with this problem of fear. Siva?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also want to say this, just to recap what Julie had mentioned. Hi waka ke noa. Did I pronounce it rightly? We are all in this together. There's a lot of work to be done, but let's not give up. It is through these forums and other things that we can bring greater awareness. And I really like the active participation of our participants. The panels do not get to see, but there's a hell of a lot of inputs from all our panelists. I really want to thank them because as at now it's almost 4:20 p.m. We have about 346 participants who are there, still actively participating, and they've brought in a lot of questions. There have been a lot of most webinars, they don't have the chat boxes, but we choose to have the chat box on and then let people comment. And I want to thank all our participants. Thank you so much. And Julie, I know it is 9 p.m. there, 9:20 p.m. I'm not sure whether you had dinner, but thank you so much for joining us all the way, And Dr. Gomes, thank you so much. And Tricia, thank you. I think we had a wonderful session. And to all our participants, thank you very much. And if our participants, if you could like to just spend a few minutes, then give your feedbacks for the sessions by clicking onto the chat box links. And with that, thank you so much again, and have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.